Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the rising threat of inflation in the Indian economy, which has been flagged by the RBI as well in its State of the Economy report. The overview of this report has been provided in a related article on page number 12, and according to it, even though the near term growth prospects look good for the economy due to the decline in the second wave of the pandemic and due to increased vaccination, the threat of inflation continues to persist. And as per the RBI's report, high inflation levels are likely to persist for a few more months. The RBI's report points out that aggregate demand in the economy is yet to pick up, which has been majorly disrupted due to the breakout of the pandemic since the last year. And on the supply side, the lack of revival in manufacturing and services, which is again an outcome of the second wave of the pandemic, has resulted in supply side shocks, even though the agriculture sector has been performing quite remarkably. Even as agri output has sustained, production levels in the manufacturing industry and services has taken a major hit due to the pandemic, especially because of the second wave. And as a result of these supply side shocks, accompanied with low aggregate demand, has created an overall mismatch in the supply demand equation, thereby driving up prices. The RBI's report expects inflation levels to persist for the next few months, and in this context, the editorial analyzes the current economic trends which are contributing to inflation and suggests a few measures in order to reduce the burden on the consumers. See, inflation is nothing but the general rise in price level over a given period of time. When the general price level rises, it will reduce the purchasing power of the currency as the currency starts losing its value and it fetches less value as the inflation rises. This inflation could be of different types. It could be demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, or inflation caused by supply shocks. See, demand pull inflation is caused due to an increase in aggregate demand in the economy, and this usually occurs when there is excess liquidity in the economy, when there is excess money supply in the markets, and when there is more money in the hands of the people, then automatically demand will rise, and if the supply doesn't match up to it, it results in inflationary conditions. Apart from this, there are several other macroeconomic factors as well, which could contribute to demand pull inflation. But this is essentially a situation where the supply demand equation has been disrupted due to a sudden and sustained increase in aggregate demand. On the other hand, we have cost push inflation, which is caused by increasing prices of inputs, rising global commodity prices, such as global oil prices, and it could be even caused by increase in taxes, increase in interest rates, etc. As the input cost rises, the product cost also goes up, thereby leading to sustained price rise in the economy. Then even major supply shocks could result in inflationary conditions, and examples include disruption in agriculture supply due to poor monsoons, or disruption in manufacturing and production due to an emergency or due to a disaster. For example, see how the pandemic has disrupted production and manufacturing, thereby causing supply side shocks, which in turn has pushed up inflation. So tackling these types of inflation is the primary mandate of the RBI and its Monetary Policy Committee. And even the government plays a role in controlling some of the inflation factors through its fiscal policy. While the RBI primarily manages inflation by regulating money supply through its monetary policy, the government can try to boost demand or it can try to ease the supply side shocks in order to manage the inflationary situation. The government could do this through its fiscal policy, that is, through its budget, through its taxation policy, and through government schemes. Currently, as per the State of the Economy report of the RBI, both retail inflation and wholesale inflation have been shooting up over the last few months, and in this regard, the RBI has raised cautionary signals. Retail inflation, that is, inflation at the consumer level, is measured by an index known as Consumer Price Index or CPI, whereas inflation at the wholesale level is measured through the WPI or the Wholesale Price Index. As per RBI's data, in the month of May, retail inflation, that is CPI inflation, stood at 6.3%, and in the month of June, it stood at 6.26%. Whereas wholesale inflation, on the other hand, stood at 12.94% and 12.07% respectively. Now, these inflationary numbers, especially high retail inflation above 6%, is a cause for great concern because this is outside the target that has been prescribed to the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI. The Monetary Policy Committee has been given an inflation target of 4%, but with a range of plus or minus 2% in order to account for any extraordinary circumstances. So at any cost, inflation should remain in the range of 2% to 6% with the ideal target of 4%. While the pandemic did constitute an extraordinary circumstance, and strict adherence to these targets was not possible for a few months, but persistent inflation levels above 6% is a cause of great concern as it could have a long-term impact on the growth of the Indian economy. Such persistent and sustained inflation, that too at the retail level, will place an unnecessary burden on the consumers, particularly in the rural areas, and it will end up having a domino effect on several other macroeconomic factors as well. The editorial points out that the current retail inflationary cycle is being driven primarily by food inflation and as well as by fuel inflation. With regard to food inflation, prices of several essential products like edible oils, fats, egg, meat, dairy products, and pulses have remained consistently high, and even fuel inflation, which excludes petrol and diesel, has been driven up consistently by other fuel sources such as LPG gas, kerosene, firewood, and dung cake, which happen to be the primary fuel sources in the rural areas. Along with this, petrol and diesel prices have gone through the roof across all cities, primarily due to rising global oil prices, which is being directly reflected in the retail prices. This, accompanied with higher taxation on petrol and diesel by our state governments and as well as by our central government, has led to an unprecedented situation where petrol diesel prices are hovering around the 100 rupee mark, and this has directly contributed to rising transportation cost. As the cost of transportation and logistics goes up, it will automatically spill over into food inflation and general retail inflation, thereby making inflation more generalized across the sectors of the economy. On the other hand, wholesale inflation is being primarily driven because of rising prices in the fuel and power sector and as well as in the manufacturing sector. While rising energy prices is primarily driven by rising global commodity prices, prices in the manufacturing industry has been going up primarily because of the pandemic. Particularly the MSME sector, that is the medium, small and micro enterprises, they have been hit very hard by the pandemic and the lockdowns because it has not only disrupted demand in this critical sector of the economy, but it has also eroded their finances. Along with this, rising input costs, that is the rising cost of fuel, power and transportation, has added to the woes of MSME sector, and this has clearly disrupted production in the MSME industries as reflected in the PMI index. The Purchasing Managers Index captures the extent of purchasing that is taking place at the manager's level, and it is seen as a key indicator of the extent of production in the manufacturing sector. But latest PMI data shows that the extent of purchasing at the manager level has gone down, which indicates a clear decline in production in the MSME industry. So as the second wave of the pandemic has left behind a devastating economic impact, we might be witnessing a possible third wave in the coming months, which is going to place further stress on the Indian economy. Along with this, the Indian Meteorological Department has predicted below average monsoons this year, which could end up affecting agricultural output as well. Last year, the only silver lining in the Indian economy was India's agricultural output. But this year, if agricultural output is also affected, along with manufacturing and services, it is going to place enormous burden on the consumers and particularly in the rural areas, because rising costs and rising inflation is going to hit the consumers very hard. So this brings the government and the RBI back to the dilemma in balancing growth and inflation. Because promoting growth and containing inflation are usually contradictory objectives. To promote growth, if the RBI continues its relaxed monetary policy, then it will go on to increase money supply, thereby contributing to inflation in the long run. But if it prematurely withdraws the monetary support, then growth could be compromised. So, this is where the editorial is asking the government to step in through its fiscal policies and provide some relief to the consumers and the rural areas by cutting taxes, especially on fuel, and by taking adequate and immediate measures to ease the supply chains which have been disrupted and support the creation of adequate demand by placing more money in the hands of the people, especially in the rural areas. Yes, these objectives appear to be contradictory to each other, but that is exactly the challenge in managing the economy. And both the government and the RBI will have to work together to keep inflation under check while promoting growth. Now, let's take up a column from page number 6, written by Mr. R.K. Raghavan, the former director of the CBI. In this column, he examines the risk posed to police investigation by growing instances of judicial interference. See, in a democracy, it's a well established fact that the executive, that is the government, has to abide by the constitution and the law of the land. And the police and the bureaucratic machinery is rightly held accountable by the elected government in order to establish the chain of accountability in a democracy. So, for any failures on the part of the police and the bureaucratic machinery, they can be held accountable by the elected government, that is, by the executive, as per the constitution and as per the established laws of the land. But in cases involving gross violation of human rights by the police, the judiciary also comes into picture. And as per its constitutional mandate, the judiciary is empowered to hold the police and the bureaucratic machinery accountable for their acts of omission and commission. This judicial power to hold the police accountable is extremely crucial for the protection of human rights and to prevent police brutality and torture. Recently, we have seen incidents such as the George Floyd incident in the United States, where a police officer pinned down a black suspect and through excessive use of force by kneeling down on his neck led to the death of George Floyd, thereby triggering massive riots and protests across the United States, along with triggering the Black Lives Matter protests, thereby raising the issue of racism that is widely prevalent in the American society. After this massive public outrage, the American judiciary held the police officer accountable as per the law of the land within the mandate of the Constitution, and the guilty officer was delivered a strict punishment. While such judicial intervention is more than welcome and necessary as well to hold the police accountable, it could also create an atmosphere where the police is completely distrusted by the judiciary and as well as by the government and the public. Now, take for example the brutal incident that happened in Tamil Nadu last year, where a few police officers were held responsible for brutally torturing and killing a father and son just for violating the lockdown restrictions. This incident of police brutality triggered outrage in India as well, thereby further increasing the distrust of the police in India. So, such acts of police violence and police brutality, which violates human rights and which goes against constitutional norms, leads the government, the public, and the judiciary to lose faith in the police, and they start holding the police accountable for its failure to uphold the constitutional mandate that it has been given with. But unfortunately, the unintended consequences of this is that due to the irresponsible and inhuman acts of a few rogue police officers, even honest police officers will have to pay the price, and there will be increased pressure on them from the government, the public, and the judiciary to constantly establish their honesty and their humanity. And this constant scrutiny, especially by the judiciary, could hamper investigation as well, especially in the case of complicated crimes. See, here the writer acknowledges the problems that persist with our policing organizations. He acknowledges the element of corruption, along with the inefficiency of Indian police, and as well as the frequent incidents of police brutality and violation of human rights. But despite that, he calls upon the government, the people, and more importantly, the judiciary to cut some slack for the police officers and police organizations and requests us to take a more kinder view of police conduct because such illegal conduct is the work of just a few minority rogue officers. But the price for this has to be paid by the entire police force, and the constant scrutiny that they come under, especially by the judiciary, ends up hampering their investigation, especially when they are dealing with complicated crimes. See, this increasing lack of faith of the judiciary in the ability of the Indian police has led Indian courts, especially the lower courts, that is, the subordinate courts, and in some cases, even the high courts, to constantly interfere in the functioning of the police, even going to the extent of issuing directions to the investigating officer while dealing with complicated crimes. And there are several instances where the court has ordered the investigating officer to carry out certain arrests and to search for evidence on suspects. This is where the writer points out that this amounts to court interference in the functioning of the police, especially in the task of police investigation, which is a specialized job being carried out by the investigating officer. In this regard, he praises the recent verdict of the Supreme Court, which prohibited the lower courts, including the high courts, from directly interfering in police work, especially from issuing orders with regard to arrests, even as the investigation is ongoing, as it violates the independence and the discretion of the investigating officer. The writer even says that such direct interference by courts in crime investigation goes completely against criminal justice ethics, which is based on English jurisprudence. In legal jurisprudence based on English law, which has been adopted in India with modification, it is strongly believed that the accused or the suspect is innocent until proven guilty. While this is the primary legal maxim, and while this is the legal jurisprudence followed in India's criminal law, the act of court interference in directing the police and the investigating officers to arrest a few suspects based on the bias of the court directly amounts to a violation of these ethics and legal jurisprudence that is an integral part of our criminal justice system. The writer says that such court interference will affect the police morale as well, because it essentially amounts to the courts distrusting the police and doubting their ability to carry out effective investigation. This in turn affects the morale and the motivation of field policing, and the writer is requesting the courts to abide by the orders of the Supreme Court and respect the professional independence and the professional capabilities of the police. See, even the law in this regard is very clear. The CRPC, or the Criminal Procedure Code, provides discretionary powers to the investigating officer with regard to arresting the accused and as well as with regard to searching for evidence. This is one domain where the courts and the government cannot directly intervene, and the ability and the integrity of the officers has to be trusted, and their interference will be justified only when the investigating officers are accused of gross misconduct. As seen in the Tamil Nadu incident, if the investigating officers are seen to be directly responsible for police brutality and torture, or if they are seen to be incompetent, then the courts could interfere only after a certain stage, but not while the investigation has just begun and not before the due process has been followed. So, in the initial stages of investigation, the writer is asking the courts, the lower courts, to trust the police and their abilities and rely upon information contained in the FIR and the case diary, as it clearly provides enough evidence to the courts with regard to the functioning of the police and the investigating officers. See, the CRPC obligates the police, that is the investigating officer, to maintain a case diary. He or she has to note down every progress that they are making on a day-to-day basis, and the case diary has to be presented in courts during prosecution. So after the investigating officer has been given his due discretion and independence to carry out the investigation, and when the matter reaches the court, then the courts have sufficient powers to review the FIR and to go through the case diary to figure out any lapses on the part of the police. Then if any gross misconduct or violations are noted, then the courts have every right to interfere and hold the police accountable. But prior to this, Interference by the courts, especially the lower courts, during the process of investigation is not justifiable, and it is not just undesirable, but it also goes against the law of the land. Because our criminal laws and as well as the constitution, they recognize the separation of powers, and there are limitations on the courts on the extent to which they can interfere in the functioning of the executive. And also the lower courts need to keep in mind that the police organizations are professional organizations which have a standard operating procedure in place, and there is a clear-cut hierarchy in the system that provides for internal accountability within the police force. Within the police hierarchy, the investigating officers are scrutinized and monitored by senior officers as well. And only when there is gross misconduct and only when there is serious violations by the police, only then can the courts interfere to hold the police accountable. But this should not happen during the initial stages of an investigation. Now let's take up a few articles that are related to sedition law, that is the controversial section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. We have been covering this topic repeatedly in our CNA and as well as in our explained session. And for the complete background to this topic, we shall be sharing the relevant links in the description box below. Even yesterday we spoke about the sedition law and how it has been challenged again at the Supreme Court, where the petitioner has asked the Supreme Court to review its own judgment in the Kedarnath case of 1962, when the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutional validity of this controversial law. While looking into this case, the Chief Justice of India, N.V. Ramana, has made a landmark observation where he has openly questioned the continued existence of the sedition law in our law books. This marks an unprecedented judicial criticism of the sedition law, which clearly is a relic of the colonial era. As we have pointed out in previous sessions, the Chief Justice of India as well has criticized the colonial nature of this law and how the colonial government had used this provision to target freedom fighters such as Mahatma Gandhi and Bal Gangadhar Tilak. This section of the IPC was primarily used by the colonial government to stifle any dissent and opposition in the name of preventing any seditious activity against the state. Its broad and vague provisions were misused by the colonial government, and unfortunately this practice has continued post-independence as well. Several central and state governments have often misused this provision to target any criticism against the government by labeling them as seditious activity. The Chief Justice has rightly questioned as to why this law has been allowed to remain in our law books, and he has sought a response from the center. This happens to be the biggest nudge that the judiciary has given to the central government with regard to removing sedition law from our law books. The Chief Justice of India has said that Section 124A of the IPC is like giving a saw to the carpenter to cut a piece of wood, and he ends up using it to cut the entire forest itself. This analogy by the Chief Justice clearly explains the extent to which sedition law has been misused and how it has been widely applied to cover every act of free speech and expression as seditious activity in order to stifle dissent and opposition against the government. The Chief Justice has pointed out the extremely low conviction rate under this law, which is a clear indicator of its wide application, and he has asked the center why these laws have been allowed to remain in the law book. In a related article on page number 9, the Hindu is of the opinion that the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice of India have sent out a strong message to the government that Section 124A of the IPC is outdated and draconian, and the time for its review and repeal has come, as it has often been used to target journalists, intellectuals, and even activists and dissenters who are opposed to the government. In a related column on page number 6, Vivek Katju, a former Indian diplomat, also makes the same argument because controversial and stringent laws such as Section 124A of the IPC, Section 66A of the IT Act, and the strong provisions of UAPA and the National Security Act, they have been often misused, which has ended up creating a bad image for India at the global level, and hence is calling upon the Indian state to show that India is a humane democracy as well, while protecting the security interests of the Indian state. The writer's argument is for a better balance in these laws, between national security and human rights. Now let's look at another editorial from page number 6 and a related article from page number 9. These articles refer to the latest meeting that took place between the Indian Foreign Minister and the Chinese State Councillor. On the sidelines of the SCO ministerial meeting, India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar met with his Chinese counterpart to discuss the current state of relations between India and China, along with the way forward for their bilateral relationship. Since last year, this relationship has been completely disrupted as a result of the border tensions that were triggered by China, which eventually resulted in the Galwan clashes. After months of heightened border tensions, both the sides worked towards a disengagement and de-escalation process, but these commitments have been fulfilled by the Chinese side only at the Panong So Lake. Whereas the border standoff continues at several other locations, including the Depsang Plains, Demchok, Gogra, and Hot Springs area. In this context, the Indian side has reminded the Chinese side as to how China violated its commitments made under the previous border agreements of 1993 and 1996. China's refusal to abide by these commitments and its inclination to change the status quo along the line of actual control has caused a lot of concern in India, as this happens to be the biggest escalation of tensions between the two countries since the 1962 conflict. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were few incidents, and even recently, between 2010 and 2020, there were few minor border incursions, including the Doklam issue, but none of them marked such a serious escalation of tensions along the India-China border. Right now, the continued refusal of China to abide by the disengagement de-escalation process has turned the situation into a stalemate, and it has led India to completely distrust China. Even as our economic relations have continued to grow, the diplomatic and strategic relations have taken a major hit because of the border issue, and hence the editorial is of the opinion that India-China relations will not improve and India will not be able to move beyond this distrust unless and until China shows the willingness to resolve the border issue. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: examine the factors that contribute to inflation and what measures could be taken to ease the burden of retail inflation. The second question: growing instances of judicial interference in an investigation are not only undesirable but also not sanctioned by law. Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.